What did I do to deserve this?
You guys, man, it were
I don't care if you're a general, old man.
72 years old, Grandpa veteran tased for no reason. 6 men later Marines take over, Frank, Gunny. Rodriguez thought his evening walk with his granddaughter would be peaceful. The 72-year-old Marine veteran never expected to be tasered by police for asking a simple question. But when his Marine brothers heard what happened, they mobilized faster than any emergency response team ever could. The suburban streets of Riverside, California, basked in the golden glow of a September evening. Children's laughter echoed from nearby playgrounds, while families enjoyed barbecues in their backyards. Oak trees lined the sidewalks, their leaves just beginning to hint at autumn colors. The peaceful neighborhood had always been Frank Rodriguez's sanctuary, a place where a retired Marine could find the tranquility that had eluded him during 3 tours in Vietnam. Tonight, like every Tuesday for the past 5 years, he walked hand in hand with his 8-year-old granddaughter Sofia, sharing stories and ice cream from the corner store. Frank Rodriguez, 72, moved with the measured stride of a man who'd spent decades in military formation. Despite his age, his posture remained ramrod straight and his silver hair was cropped in regulation style. The Marine Corps emblem tattooed on his forearm had faded but remained visible, a permanent reminder of his service from 1968 to 1992. His granddaughter Sofia adored these evening walks when Grandpa Gunny would tell her stories about honor, courage, and always doing what's right. Frank had earned his nickname Gunny during his time as a gunnery sergeant, leading young Marines through some of the most dangerous missions in Vietnam. After retiring, he'd worked as a high school ROTC instructor, shaping another generation of young people with military discipline and values. Now, in his golden years, his greatest joy came from spending time with Sofia, teaching her the same lessons about integrity and standing up for others that he'd instilled in countless Marines. His weathered hands, scarred from combat and decades of hard work, gently held Sofia's small fingers as they walked past the familiar houses of neighbors who'd known him for 20 years. What Frank didn't know was that a domestic disturbance call 3 blocks away had police on high alert. Officer Derek Mason, a 5-year veteran with the Riverside Police Department, was responding to reports of an elderly man acting suspiciously near the elementary school. The call had been vague, mentioning only that someone had seen an older man loitering near the playground. Mason, already stressed from a difficult shift and lacking experience with de-escalation techniques, was approaching the situation with unnecessary aggression. The stage was set for a confrontation that would shake the entire community and demonstrate the power of brotherhood that transcends decades. As Frank and Sofia approached the corner near Riverside Elementary, they noticed a police cruiser parked with its lights flashing. Officer Mason stepped out, his hand resting on his duty belt as he scanned the area. Frank, with his military instincts still sharp, immediately recognized the tension in the officer's posture. "Grandpa, why are the police here?" Sofia whispered instinctively, moving closer to Frank's side. "I don't know, sweetheart, but let's find out if everything's okay." Frank replied, his natural inclination to help others overriding any personal concerns. Frank approached the officer with the same respectful demeanor he'd taught countless young Marines. "Good evening, officer. I'm Frank Rodriguez. My granddaughter and I walk this route every Tuesday. Is there anything we should be concerned about?" Mason turned sharply, his eyes immediately focusing on Frank with suspicion rather than appreciation for the offer of assistance. "Sir, I need you to step back. We're investigating a suspicious person report in this area." Frank's eyebrows raised slightly. "A suspicious person? Officer, I've lived in this neighborhood for 20 years. Maybe I can help identify—" "I said step back," Mason interrupted, his voice rising with unnecessary aggression. Frank felt Sofia's hand tighten in his as the officer's tone grew hostile. His military training kicked in, assess the situation, protect the innocent, de-escalate when possible. He gently guided Sofia to stand slightly behind him while maintaining a non-threatening posture. "Officer Mason," Frank said, reading the nameplate, "I'm a retired Marine Gunnery Sergeant. I'm just trying to understand if there's a safety concern for my granddaughter and the other families in this neighborhood." Mason's face flushed red. "I don't care what you used to be, old man. You're interfering with police business." Frank's jaw tightened, but his voice remained calm. "I'm not interfering, son. I'm offering assistance from someone who knows this community. If you're looking for someone suspicious, I might be able to help." The irony wasn't lost on Frank. He was being treated as a threat while trying to help ensure community safety. His phone buzzed in his pocket with a text from his daughter asking when they'd be home. Sofia tugged on his sleeve, clearly frightened by the officer's aggressive demeanor. "Grandpa, can we go home now?" she whispered. Frank squeezed her hand reassuringly. "In just a minute, sweetheart." "Officer, my granddaughter is scared. Could you please lower your voice?" Frank asked, his tone respectful but firm. "We're just trying to get home safely." Mason stepped closer, interpreting Frank's calm authority as defiance. "Are you telling me how to do my job?" "No, sir. I'm asking you to consider that there's a child present and your aggressive posture is unnecessarily frightening her." The words hit Mason like a challenge to his authority. In his mind, this elderly man was questioning his competence in front of witnesses. Several neighbors had emerged from their homes, drawn by the commotion and flashing lights. "Sir, I need to see your identification," Mason demanded. Frank slowly reached for his wallet, moving deliberately to avoid any misinterpretation of his actions. "Of course, officer. Here's my driver's license and my military ID." As Frank extended the documents, Mason grabbed his wrist roughly. "I said don't move." "Officer, I was complying with your request for identification," Frank said, his military training keeping his voice steady despite the inappropriate physical contact. Sofia began to cry, terrified by the escalating confrontation. The sound of her tears would haunt Frank for months to come, but it would also serve as the catalyst for everything that followed. The situation deteriorated rapidly as more neighbors gathered to witness the confrontation. Mrs. Chen from across the street called out, "Officer, that's Frank Rodriguez. He's lived here for 20 years. He's a veteran." Mason spun around, his frustration mounting. "Everyone needs to disperse immediately, or you'll be arrested for interfering with police business." Frank tried once more to de-escalate. "Officer Mason, please. You're scaring my granddaughter and the neighbors. I've shown you my identification. I'm clearly not the person you're looking for." "How do I know that?" Mason shot back. "You could be anyone. You could be the suspect." Frank's patience, honed by decades of military discipline, began to wear thin. "Officer, I'm 72 years old walking with an 8-year-old child. What exactly do you suspect me of?" Mason's radio crackled with updates from dispatch adding to his stress. The original call had been vague, and he was feeling pressure to produce results. Frank's calm demeanor and obvious community support only made Mason feel more defensive about his handling of the situation. "Turn around and put your hands behind your back," Mason ordered suddenly. Frank stared in disbelief. "On what grounds, officer?" "Obstruction of justice and failure to comply with lawful orders." Unknown to Mason, several neighbors were recording the encounter on their phones. Mrs. Chen had immediately called her son David, a local news reporter who was already en route to the scene. More importantly, Frank's neighbor Tom Wilson, a retired Marine colonel, had witnessed the confrontation from his front porch and was making urgent phone calls of his own. "This is Colonel Wilson. I need to speak with the duty officer at Camp Pendleton immediately," he said into his phone. "We have a situation involving one of our own." Meanwhile, Sofia's tears had turned to sobs as she watched her beloved grandfather being treated like a criminal. Frank knelt down to her level despite Mason's protests. "Sofia, sweetheart, remember what Grandpa taught you about being brave? I need you to be brave right now. Can you do that for me?" She nodded through her tears. "Are you in trouble, Grandpa?" "No, baby. This is just a misunderstanding. But I need you to go to Mrs. Chen's house and call Mommy, okay?" Mason stepped forward aggressively. "Nobody's going anywhere until I sort this out." The crowd was growing larger and more vocal in their support for Frank, creating additional pressure on the increasingly isolated officer. Frank stood slowly, his hands visible and non-threatening. "Officer, I'm going to comply with your orders, but I want these witnesses to know that I'm doing so under protest. I've committed no crime, and this detention is unlawful." His military bearing and calm authority in the face of injustice resonated with the crowd. Several people began calling out their support. "Frank's a hero. He served our country. This is ridiculous. He's the most respected man in the neighborhood. Officer, you're making a huge mistake." Mason felt cornered by the crowd's hostility and Frank's dignified resistance. In his mind, he'd lost control of the situation and needed to reassert his authority. He reached for his handcuffs, but Frank's natural leadership presence seemed to diminish Mason's authority with every passing moment. "Sir, I'm asking you one final time to reconsider this course of action," Frank said, his voice carrying the weight of decades of command experience. "You're about to arrest a decorated veteran in front of his granddaughter for no legitimate reason." The words hung in the air like a challenge. Mason's pride wouldn't allow him to back down now, especially with so many people watching and recording. As Mason moved to handcuff Frank, the elderly veteran instinctively stepped back to maintain distance, a natural defensive reaction from his military training. Mason interpreted this as resistance and reached for his taser. "Don't move!" Mason shouted, drawing the weapon. The crowd gasped collectively. Frank raised his hand slowly, his eyes never leaving Mason's face. "Officer, I'm not resisting. I'm simply maintaining a safe distance as I was trained to do. You're resisting arrest. I'm standing still with my hands visible. How is that resistance?" Frank's question exposed the absurdity of the situation to everyone present. Here was a 72-year-old grandfather, clearly posing no threat, being threatened with a taser for asking reasonable questions and trying to protect his granddaughter. Tom Wilson's phone calls had reached their target. At Camp Pendleton, 45 minutes away, a group of Marines who'd served under Frank were learning about the situation. Master Sergeant Rodriguez, no relation, was coordinating a response that would arrive faster than anyone imagined. "Gunny's in trouble," he told his team. "We're rolling out now." The brotherhood that Frank had built over decades of service was about to demonstrate its power in ways that would shock everyone present. What happened next would be replayed on news channels across the nation. As Frank stood with his hands raised trying to reason with an increasingly agitated Officer Mason, Sofia broke free from Mrs. Chen's protective grip and ran toward her grandfather. "Don't hurt my grandpa," she cried, wrapping her small arms around Frank's legs. The sight of the terrified child clinging to her grandfather should have been enough to de-escalate any reasonable officer. Instead, Mason saw it as further defiance of his authority. "Get the child away from the suspect," he shouted. Frank gently tried to guide Sofia back toward safety. "Sweetheart, please go back to Mrs. Chen. Grandpa will be okay." But Sofia refused to let go her 8-year-old mind, unable to comprehend why police would want to hurt the man who taught her about heroes and doing the right thing. Her presence should have been a reminder of Frank's obvious harmlessness, but Mason was beyond rational thinking. Last warning, step away from the child. Frank's protective instincts flared. "Officer, she's scared. Give me a moment to calm her down." As Frank knelt to comfort Sofia, Mason made his fatal decision. "Taser, taser, taser," he shouted, following protocol as he pulled the trigger. The electrical current hit Frank's body like lightning. The 72-year-old veteran collapsed instantly, his body convulsing as 50,000 volts coursed through him. Sofia screamed as her grandfather fell beside her, his body rigid with electrical shock. The crowd's reaction was immediate and explosive. Shouts of outrage filled the air as neighbors rushed forward to help the fallen veteran. Mrs. Chen grabbed Sofia, pulling her away from Frank's convulsing body while calling 911 for medical assistance. "You tasered a 72-year-old man," someone screamed. "Are you insane?" Mason stood frozen, the taser still in his hand, as the reality of his actions began to sink in. Frank lay motionless on the sidewalk, his body no longer responding to the electrical current, but clearly injured from the fall and the shock. Tom Wilson pushed through the crowd, his military training taking over as he knelt beside Frank to check his pulse. Frank, can you hear me?" Frank's eyes fluttered open, but he was disoriented and in obvious pain. "Sofia, is Sofia okay?" he whispered. "She's safe, Frank. Just stay still. Help is coming." The sound of sirens filled the air as paramedics and additional police units responded to the multiple 911 calls. But there was another sound, growing louder, the rumble of motorcycles and vehicles approaching at high speed. Mason's supervisor, Sergeant Williams, arrived to find a scene of chaos. A decorated veteran lay injured on the sidewalk, a traumatized child was crying hysterically, and an angry crowd was demanding justice. The body camera footage would later show the complete unreasonableness of Mason's actions, but the immediate concern was Frank's condition. "What the hell happened here, Mason?" Sergeant Williams demanded. Before Mason could answer, the first wave of Marines arrived. Master Sergeant Rodriguez led a convoy of vehicles carrying 20 active duty Marines from Camp Pendleton, all of whom had served under Frank at various points in their careers. The Marines' arrival changed everything. They emerged from their vehicles in uniform, moving with military precision to secure the scene. Master Sergeant Rodriguez approached Sergeant Williams, with the bearing of a man accustomed to command. "Sergeant, I'm Master Sergeant Rodriguez, United States Marine Corps. The man your officer just tasered is Gunnery Sergeant Frank Rodriguez, retired a decorated Vietnam veteran and one of the finest Marines I've ever served under." Williams looked between the injured Frank and the growing number of Marines surrounding the scene. "Master Sergeant, this is a civilian police matter." "With respect, Sergeant, when one of our own is attacked without justification, it becomes our concern too." The Marines formed a protective perimeter around Frank as paramedics worked on him. Their presence was not threatening, but it was unmistakably powerful. These were men and women who'd learned leadership, honor, and courage from Frank Rodriguez, and they weren't going to stand by while he was mistreated. Officer Mason found himself facing not just an angry crowd of neighbors, but a group of active duty Marines who viewed his actions as an assault on their brotherhood. The dynamic had shifted completely, and Mason was no longer the one with authority in this situation. As paramedics stabilized Frank for transport to the hospital, Master Sergeant Rodriguez coordinated with his Marines to ensure proper documentation of the incident. Several Marines were filming everything, while others were taking statements from witnesses. Their military training in evidence collection and chain of custody would prove invaluable in the legal proceedings to come. "I want every angle covered," Rodriguez told his team. "Gunny taught us to be thorough, and we're going to honor that training." Frank, though weak and disoriented from the tasing, insisted on speaking to Sofia before being transported. "Come here, sweetheart," he whispered as she approached the stretcher. "Grandpa, are you going to be okay?" she asked, her voice small and frightened. "I'm going to be fine, baby. And you know what? Look around you, see all these Marines? They're here because your grandpa taught them to take care of each other. That's what family does." Sofia looked at the uniformed Marines surrounding them and seemed to understand something important about the bonds her grandfather had forged through his service. The Marines weren't just colleagues, they were brothers who would move heaven and earth for one of their own. As Frank was loaded into the ambulance, he struggled with conflicting emotions. The physical pain from the tasing was manageable, but the emotional impact ran deeper. He questioned whether pursuing this matter would be worth the stress and attention it would bring to his family. "Maybe I should just let it go," he confided to Master Sergeant Rodriguez during the ride to the hospital. "I don't want Sofia to have to relive this." But Rodriguez had a different perspective. "Sir, with respect, this isn't just about you anymore. It's about every veteran who might face this kind of treatment. Your courage in standing up to this will protect others." Frank looked out the ambulance window at the convoy of Marines following them to the hospital. Their loyalty and dedication reminded him of why he'd spent his life serving others and why that service couldn't end just because he'd retired. The hospital became an impromptu command center as Marines coordinated their response to Frank's treatment. Word had spread through military networks, and veterans from across Southern California were converging on Riverside Community Hospital. The parking lot filled with motorcycles, pickup trucks with military decals, and active duty personnel in uniform. Inside, Frank was being treated for injuries sustained from both the electrical shock and his fall to the pavement. At 72, his body couldn't absorb the trauma as easily as it might have decades earlier. Doctors were monitoring his heart rhythm and checking for signs of neurological damage. The media had arrived in force with news vans lining the hospital's perimeter. The story was spreading rapidly on social media with "Justice for Gunny" trending nationwide. The video footage of a 72-year-old veteran being tasered while protecting his granddaughter had struck a nerve with Americans across the political spectrum. The Riverside Police Department initially tried to defend Mason's actions, claiming he had followed proper procedures in response to a suspicious person call. Their official statement suggested that Frank had been non-compliant and potentially threatening. This narrative collapsed immediately when the body camera footage was released. The video clearly showed Frank's respectful demeanor, his attempts to de-escalate the situation, and his obvious lack of any threatening behavior. The sight of him being tasered while comforting his terrified granddaughter was devastating to the police department's credibility. Public opinion turned decisively against the department, with veterans organizations, civil rights groups, and community leaders all demanding accountability. The police union's attempt to support Mason only made the situation worse, as it appeared they were defending the indefensible. Mayor Patricia Gonzalez called for an immediate investigation, while the police chief announced that Mason had been placed on administrative leave pending a full review of the incident. The breakthrough came when Frank himself decided to speak publicly about the incident. From his hospital bed, surrounded by Marines and family members, he addressed the media with the same dignity and authority that had defined his military career. "I didn't serve 3 tours in Vietnam so that I could be treated like an enemy in my own neighborhood," Frank said, his voice steady despite his injuries. "But this isn't really about me. It's about how we treat our elderly, our veterans, and our children. That officer's actions traumatized my granddaughter and showed a complete lack of judgment and humanity." His words resonated across the nation, but it was his next statement that truly captured the moment. "I'm proud of these Marines who came to support me today. They represent the best of what our military teaches: loyalty, honor, and standing up for what's right. They've shown more professionalism and restraint in the last few hours than that officer showed in 5 minutes." The contrast was stark between Mason's aggressive escalation and the Marines' disciplined response, between the police department's defensive posture and Frank's gracious dignity. The incident had become a symbol of larger issues about police accountability and respect for veterans. The resolution came swiftly and decisively. Within 48 hours, Officer Mason was terminated from the Riverside Police Department and faced criminal charges for assault and excessive force. The district attorney, facing overwhelming public pressure and clear video evidence, announced that Mason would be prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law. The city of Riverside agreed to a $2.8 million settlement with Frank and implemented comprehensive police reform measures, including mandatory de-escalation training and special protocols for interactions with elderly citizens and veterans. The police chief resigned, and the department underwent a complete review of its training and procedures. But the real victory was broader than individual accountability. Frank's case became a catalyst for nationwide police reform, with the Frank Rodriguez Act being introduced in Congress to provide special protections for veterans and elderly citizens in police encounters. The legislation required additional training for officers and established federal oversight of departments with patterns of excessive force against vulnerable populations. The immediate aftermath brought sweeping changes to the Riverside Police Department and police training nationwide. The Frank Rodriguez case became a textbook example of how not to handle community policing studied in police academies across the country, as a lesson in de-escalation and respect for vulnerable populations. Mason was convicted of assault and sentenced to 2 years in prison, becoming one of the few police officers to face serious consequences for excessive force against an elderly person. His conviction sent a message throughout law enforcement that such behavior would not be tolerated. Frank used his settlement to establish the Sofia Rodriguez Foundation, named after his granddaughter, which provides legal advocacy and support for elderly victims of police misconduct. The foundation also funds community programs that bring police and veterans together to build understanding and mutual respect. The Marines who responded to support Frank were commended by their commanding officers for their professionalism and loyalty, demonstrating the positive power of military brotherhood in civilian situations. 3 years later, the Frank Rodriguez case continues to influence police reform efforts nationwide. The incident led to the creation of new federal guidelines for police interactions with elderly citizens and veterans, requiring specialized training and de-escalation protocols. The Sofia Rodriguez Foundation has helped over 200 elderly victims of police misconduct, providing legal representation and advocacy services. The foundation's work has resulted in policy changes in dozens of police departments and millions of dollars in settlements for victims of excessive force. Frank himself became a sought-after speaker on police reform and veteran advocacy, testifying before Congress and working with law enforcement agencies to improve their training programs. His message of dignity, respect, and accountability resonated with audiences across the political spectrum. The Marines who supported Frank during his crisis have maintained their connection, creating an informal network of veteran advocates who respond to similar incidents across the country. Their model of disciplined, peaceful intervention has been adopted by veteran organizations nationwide. On a quiet Tuesday evening, exactly 1 year after the incident, Frank and Sofia resumed their weekly walks through the neighborhood. This time, they were accompanied by Officer Jennifer Martinez Mason's replacement, who had requested the opportunity to meet Frank and learn from his experience. As they walked past the spot where Frank had been tasered, Sofia looked up at her grandfather. "Grandpa, are you still scared of the police?" Frank smiled, watching Officer Martinez interact respectfully with other neighbors. "No, sweetheart. Most police officers are good people who want to help. We just have to make sure they remember that everyone deserves to be treated with dignity and respect." Together, they continued their walk, a symbol of healing and hope for the future.